This is the Bartholomew Town Podcast.
Well, one thing's for sure, and that is when we head into 2022, it's going to be a pretty significant year in Rhode Island politics and in Rhode Island political media. It's obviously been talked about since the 2018 election that, hey, 2022 is going to be a crowded gubernatorial field, other offices as well. And there's a lot of opportunity on the table for people to come in and potentially reshape the dynamics of Rhode Island politics. And it's pretty clear that Matt Brown, in both his bid to become governor of Rhode Island and his co-chairing of the Rhode Island Political Cooperative, and Senator Cynthia Mendes in her bid to become lieutenant governor, and their approach to run on a joint ticket under the umbrella of the Rhode Island Political Cooperative, have that exact strategy in mind and front and center in their campaigns. It's Bill Bartholomew here with you for another edition of Rhode Island's podcast of record, the Bartholomew Town Podcast. As always, appreciate you listening along. Remember to follow me on Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok at Bill Bartholomew, and join the Bartholomew Town Podcast Facebook group. And of course, you can become a B-Town Insider for as little as $3 per month by visiting patreon.com/BartholomewTown, or just go ahead and click the support link wherever you're listening right now. There's so much to get to in these conversations with gubernatorial candidates in general, but especially when we're looking at the gubernatorial, and in this case, gubernatorial and lieutenant gubernatorial races. There's so many specifics we can get into. You know, there's got to be 150 issues that we could bring up. And hopefully, my intention anyway is over the course of 2022, hopefully all of the candidates would be willing to come on for multiple appearances here on the podcast, and we can kind of specifically get into, okay, let's talk, whatever, education. Let's talk environmental reform. Let's talk, fiscal policy. Let's talk this, that, and the other, and do deep dives into specifics. In this 2021 version of Conversations, we've kind of been focusing on big picture issues, sort of a primer for people who have very little knowledge of the candidates themselves. And, that's kind of where we go today, though we do get into some specific areas as well in this conversation. We have had, during 2021, we've had Governor McKee, we've had Treasurer Magaziner on a number of times, Secretary Gorbea on a number of times. We have had Dr. Munoz on a number of times, and now we have Matt Brown on as well, along with Senator Mendes. And we've reached out to the Helena Folks camp a number of times, hoping that Ms. Folks will join us here on the pod at some point as well. And whatever gubernatorial candidates the GOP put forth, hopefully we'll be able to have that perspective here on the show for you out there. Okay, without further ado, let's get to it. Matt Brown and Senator Cynthia Mendes here on B-Town. All right, so we continue our deep dive into the gubernatorial, and in this case, the lieutenant gubernatorial race here on B-Town, as we've now caught up with most of the candidates here in these last few months. Two more to go in terms of the announced candidates, and we're going to get to one of them right now, and that's Matt Brown, along with Cynthia Mendes, it's interesting because the presentation of a joint ticket, obviously it's not formal. There are states that do run governor and lieutenant governor as a joint ticket, if you will. It's not something that's happened in Rhode Island. And I think we saw during COVID-19 with the Raimondo-McKee dynamic, how there's definitely a good reason to have the administration on the same page, if you will. And that the learning curve, if for some reason the governor steps aside for any number of reasons, is reduced significantly if there is a joint ticket. But I guess let's get right into it. Why did you decide to run this time around, Matt? And why did you decide to do it in the context of a joint ticket with Cynthia?
Well, I think those two things are related, Bill. I think, we've had the same corrupt, conservative political establishment running things here for decades, and they've dug a massive, massive hole for people in the state. Most people in the state are either struggling or outright suffering. Struggling meaning struggling with debt, struggling to pay their bills, struggling to afford healthcare, struggling to find a decent school for their kids, just deep struggling. And then there are a whole lot of people in the state who are just suffering, who are underwater, who have slipped through the cracks. And so we have a just crisis piled on top of crisis in the state, and there's no one person who can dig us out of that hole. We need to do this together. And so that begins for us with the two of us running together, not running alone, but doing this in partnership. And then secondly, as you know, it's not just the two of us, but we're also running alongside what will be a slate of 50 awesome candidates who care about their communities, who are going to fight to solve these problems for people. So there's never been anything like it in this state. There's honestly never been anything like it in this scale in the country to win a progressive governing majority to solve these problems. So it's what we think we're going to need to do to dig out of the hole that this corrupt political establishment has dug for all of us. But Cynthia?
Yeah, I'm really excited about the ticket for all the reasons that you both have mentioned. And because to show this example, to really exemplify not just running together, but also governing together in deep partnership. And that's something that we don't see. And so to be able to do that, and to be honest, for those of us that have been plugging up the gaps of the broken system, that's the way we've been doing it all along, in deep collaboration. And so this is nothing new for the folks that have been kind of sweeping up and cleaning up the mess and the debris left by really poor legislation and poor leaders. And so, yeah, why wouldn't that be the example of the way that we would run our campaign, since it's the way that we run our lives?
I'm reminded of a coalition in West Virginia that ran in 2019 across a statewide coalition. It really wasn't necessarily explicitly progressive. There were mixed results in terms of that effort. Speaking now more broadly to just the coalition's efforts on a statewide basis, then we'll zoom in on the gubernatorial and lieutenant gubernatorial race. Does the model have enough nuance where in some of the rural districts, in some of the coastal districts, can the same messaging work across the board? And if that same messaging is going to be driving each of your campaigns and your collective top of the ticket campaign, if you will it translate to a statewide audience?
100%. I mean, Cynthia should speak to her experience with her election last time. But the message, Bill, is that people cannot make ends meet. People are exhausted. People have been ignored by this government. We have a government and a political establishment that takes corporate PAC money, corporate lobbyist money, and works for those interests and for the wealthy and for the connected, and not for the interests of the people of this state. And the people know that. And the all the things that we are fighting for, that Cynthia and I are fighting for, that the candidates of the Rhode Island Political Cooperative are fighting for, these are common sense things. And almost everybody in the state, across the state, in every district agrees with them. The issue is that the other side, those in power, have had lots of political money from their corporate PAC and corporate lobbyist and donor friends. And we have needed to build the capacity and the ability to get out there and get our message out to voters and win campaigns. And that's what we did in 2020, and we saw the results with the wins by the Rhode Island Political Cooperative. And now we're just taking that to a bigger scale. But Cynthia should talk about her experience in that election and what it was like out on the doors.
Yeah, it became really clear when we were out on the doors that the messaging works, the messengers hadn't. Like, that's what it comes down to. And so, like, when we talk about, hey, Medicare for all, well, we know people have started GoFundMes and have worried about their neighbors that may lose their house because they're going into medical debt, and how can they help their cousin who has brain cancer, is not going to be able to get the treatment that they need, or is going to go underwater and have to move, real stories. And so, to the question, sorry, my cat is making an appearance. To the question of, to every nook and cranny in the state, would the messaging and would the platform relate? Yes, because the messengers have lived it and breathed it. They know it. It's essentially about proximity. So, when you have local candidates who are birthed from their community, who have the stories of their community etched on their heart, who know the stakes. There's really no question. This is not talking, but the reason why it hasn't worked before, a reason why it seems, oh, would it work in, this district and that district, is because the messaging and the messenger was completely disconnected, and therefore those talking points were completely irrelevant. When someone has a local candidate has their finger on the pulse of their community, it's going to relate and it's going to work. We did it before and I'm going to do it again.
There's some issues that jump out, like police reform, where in Providence, certainly in certain parts of Providence or in the urban core in general, that messaging, it comes from a lived experience that may be different than certain other districts. And perhaps the argument might be made, well, look, in some of the rural districts or suburban districts, there's a different sentiment about something like police reform than there is inside of the urban core. That's obviously not a generic statement. There are certainly exceptions to that in both ways. But in those types of areas, do you think that there's a way to sort of thread that needle and say, hey, look, even if you are on the opposite side of a single issue, the collective platform betters you, and we can have a debate another time about issues that you may not necessarily identify with?
Yeah, I think the core agenda, Bill, I think we just have to be clear about the degree to which people across this state, almost everyone, are exhausted, feel beaten down, not for 6 months, but for a long time. And that they know, you go out to the grocery store, go out on the street, ask somebody if they think that this political machine that's been running things has been looking out for them and cares about them and is working for them and is doing a good job. And the answer is going to be no. From almost every corner, as Cynthia said, every nook and cranny in the state, the answer is no. That's not news. Like, the degree to which people know this political establishment has turned their backs on them and don't care about them, that is not news. The news is, for the first time in memory, there's something we can do about it. Because this time, it's not just one person running for governor. It's not just one person running for lieutenant governor. We're talking about 50 people across the state from their communities who've been doing the work in their communities, who care about their communities, who have suffered the consequences of this corrupt, uncaring political establishment for years, are now standing up and saying, we're done. Now we're going to govern. And we're going to govern for the people, and we're going to do it now. We're not going to do things like get, $1.1 billion from the federal government that's literally designed to explicitly rescue the people of this state and sit on the money for 7 months. We're not going to govern that way. We're going to govern for the people. We're going to fight for the people. And it's the first time in memory, in my lifetime, certainly, that there is a chance that we could get a government that's going to work for us because of this great group of candidates and the Rhode Island Political Cooperative and our partners, Sunrise, Black Lives Matter, all of them coming together and fighting for finally getting a government that's going to fight for the people of this state.
It seems like more than ever, there's an appetite for disruptors across various sectors, in the media, in education, in whatever industry that there may be. And certainly in politics, there's an appetite for it. Yet at the same time, oftentimes when it comes to actually pulling the trigger inside the voting booth, people go with what they're most comfortable with. Governor McKee will ride the platform or position, if you will, of being the incumbent. He's dogged by a number of scandals right now, or at least things that are swirling. The ILO group comes to mind. There's no doubt about that. He obviously had a tough summer with the resignation of his first chief of staff, Anthony Silva. Are those things, though, that the average voter will pick up on and will say, you know what, McKee represents, in their minds, represents what you describe as that corrupt establishment, and then look to you and say, this is the answer to get out of this current situation, and you will be the disruptor that can reach the average everyday Rhode Islander that maybe doesn't even pay attention to the day-to-day news? This episode is brought to you by Elmwood Songwriters Club, presented by B-Town. It's a monthly showcase featuring 7 artists from all around the region. With the order drawn at random, each artist performs 2 songs. You can find details about when the next event is here in Providence by following me on Twitter and Instagram at Bill Bartholomew.
I'll say one thing quickly, but I think, Cynthia, it would be really helpful to kind of give your experience of what's honestly a very similar situation to what you just outlined, Bill, which is, Cynthia ran against a very powerful, very entrenched, very well-funded incumbent.
Yeah, Conley.
Yep. Yeah. And so I think it's actually a really interesting and important example of like how that unfolded. But I'll just say briefly that what we are putting forward to the people of the state in this campaign is not the opportunity to elect one person as governor or 2 of us governor and lieutenant governor. We're talking about electing a whole new government. And I believe from the experience we had with the great wins with the Rhode Island Political Cooperative in 2020, and just from what we've seen across the state, that when people see and believe that we all of us together can elect a new government and get rid of this corrupt crowd, that people are going to want to take that path, that they're going to want to go in that direction. But Cynthia, I think it would be helpful, to kind of explain what it was really like, going up against an entrenched incumbent.
Yeah, I think it was really eye-opening on the doors. That was where it became really revealing, talking to neighbors and community members about just how possible this was and just how hopeful it was. It didn't feel like disrupting. It felt like finally. It felt like, oh, this is us. You're speaking my language. This is. It felt like being seen. It didn't feel like disrupting. Why it feels like disrupting? It only feels like disrupting to the tight-fisted people that have the grip on power and the grip on resources. It feels like disrupting when they didn't give you permission to speak and you speak anyway. It feels like disrupting when you say that's not the way you handle resources. That's not the way you look out for everyday people. That feels like disrupting. But when I'm talking about the things that I believe in, it turns out that most of the people in the community believe in that too, and they feel seen and heard. And so. I really reject the idea that, of being an irritant or a disruptor or any of those things, because that really only happens in the halls of power when they don't want to hear it and they hear things they don't want to hear. And that is a really, really important distinction. And that's one that's very true of women of color, by the way, where we get labeled as disruptors, we get labeled as really, because we're bringing uncomfortable truths often that people don't want to talk about. And so, but the truth of the matter is we're just reflecting back to the powers that be things they don't want to see about themselves. And that can be really uncomfortable.
Yeah, it's really interesting to think of you as in your campaign as a mirror and sort of focusing, okay, this gigantic mirror the size of Rhode Island, like 10,000 helicopters flying over with a mirror tethered beneath it, flying over the state, and just, hey, take a look and think about what's happening. Does this work for you? Yes or no? It's a much more basic thing than invading, so to speak. And I think some folks probably hear the messaging around revolution, and that makes them start to think of things in less of a reflective manner and more of that disruptive manner. Do you imagine that your messaging will become more of a more nuanced as the campaign moves forward, or are you going to kind of stick to that, hey, we're taking over the State House mentality?
I guess I honestly don't think of it as messaging. Like I don't like when Cynthia and I, talk about things and with each other, but also when we put out statements, publicly, what we're talking about is here's a problem and it's not being solved. And what would we do to solve it? Like that's the message, like that's kind of, and that's partly because I'm sure Cynthia and I both have spent almost all of our working lives in doing community work, not doing politics. And so I don't think we really think of things in terms of like, what's the political angle? What's the political message? We think of things of what's the problem that people are facing and what are we going to do about it? And then we say that. And then after we win with all of the co-op candidates, then we're going to do it. And by the way, I think the important thing to note here is like, I think people have become so resigned in the state to having this terrible political establishment that runs things. And we've lowered our expectations wildly to like what we could get for people like to solve the problems in our communities. And the things that we now accept as kind of normal, like the quality of our schools, like the fact that people can't afford to see a doctor, like hospitals closing in this state, like, on and on and on and on. And part of what we are trying to get across to people is, if we all come together and pull this off, which we believe we will, and win a governing majority, and the two of us win our races, then we have the ability on day one to pass an agenda that is grounded in these values and policies, that everybody who works earns a living wage, that every kid in this state, regardless of what your neighborhood is, you get a good education, that everybody can afford to go to the doctor, that we're going to shut down fossil fuel industry because we should have done it a long time ago and be the first state in the country that runs on clean energy. Like, we will have a government with those policies. And we will have a government with those policies on day one. State Senate, State House, governor, lieutenant governor working together to get those things done for the state. We've never had that in my lifetime.
I want to go to sort of a lightning round here, and we'll start with Senator Mendes and just the hypothetical matchups, if you will. I mean, this is kind of stupid. We could probably have some theme music blasting behind us here, ESPN style.
I like it. Let's do it.
All right, so let's start with something totally absurd, most likely. But let's say you win the Democratic primary. The only person who's really thrown their name into, and they haven't announced yet, but has been suggested as a candidate on, I don't know if he could go back to being a Republican, but as an independent conservative, is Joe Trillo. Do you think you match up well against Joe Trillo?
I feel bad for anyone that decides to get into this race, to be honest.
Wow.
Like, I really just feel bad for anybody that would decide to do that at this point. I think we've, proven that we do have the finger on the pulse of our communities and really carry their stories and their values with us. And I don't see that, with anybody that's, with my opponent or with those that are getting in there, would think about getting in the race. I would highly suggest that they don't. But
and you feel the same way about Lieutenant Governor Matos right now in terms of their position. And, there are some who say, look, she has a tremendous understanding of the nuances of not only Providence on the ground, but of municipal and now state government. Are you concerned about that matchup there in terms of just policy and presentation, or do you still have that same confidence?
Yeah, I've talked to people in Providence. I have the same confidence.
Gotcha. Yep. All right, Matt, it's an interesting slate of people. The name that comes up a lot, at least on the ground when I'm out at different actions or protests or whatever it may be, things of that sort, is Dr. Munoz. And while there's certainly distinctions between you two politically on a number of levels, why are you the better choice, or what would your argument be to anyone who's a Munoz supporter as to why what you're offering is either more practical and viable, or politically and policy-wise a more sound option?
I just don't think there's any one person who can dig out of the hole that we've got in this state, and not the governor, not the new Senate president we'll have after we win these elections, not the new Speaker of the House that we'll have after we win these elections. It's going to take an effort to win the governor's race, the lieutenant governor's race, a majority in the Senate, a majority in the House. And we're the only candidates, Cynthia and I, who have been and are continuing to work to build the movement to do that.
And I think to that point, and I know that was a question directed at Matt, but I think it's really another really important distinction is that in politics, all we've ever seen is an egocentric political campaign where it's every man for themselves. And I'm like so proud to be a part of a ticket and a mission to show what it looks like when you share power, when you work in collaboration. Nobody's doing that. Nobody else is doing that. And so moving from this very egocentric, every man for themselves way of doing politics, and also way of governing to this very shared, working in deep partnership way of campaigning and of governing, and which is what Matt and I plan to do. And no one else is offering a way of doing that because it just doesn't occur to them. And that has to be because this is a campaign that is very tied to the way that we've lived our lives and the way that we've served our communities. And therefore that's the way that we're going to be campaigning. That's why I'm very, very proud to be running with Matt.
Last question, sort of pivoting off of the previous question. So you've obviously laid out your case with respect to Governor McKee, but Treasurer Magaziner, Secretary Gorbea, and now Helena Foulkes, who is, a lot of people see as Raimondo 2.0. There obviously are distinctions there. One, she's much wealthier. Do you see yourself drawing a line that is so radically different in terms of standpoint and position that anybody who is considering voting based on a need for change couldn't possibly vote for anyone besides you? Do you see all the other candidates as members of the corrupt establishment that you describe?
Well, yeah, I think what we are offering is very, very different. First of all, right off the bat, we're the only candidates in our races that don't take corporate PAC, corporate lobbyists, fossil fuel money, and which is incredible given this is a Democratic primary. We've got a Democratic political machine in this state that honestly, in most parts of the country, would be Republicans. I mean, look, the ARPA money, as you know, Bill, we are the only state in the country run by Democrats that hasn't spent a dime of the ARPA money. The only states left that haven't spent any money, there's like 11 or 12 of them. They're all deep red states. And so that's who this political machine is aligned with. What we're offering is something completely different, extremely common sense. As Cynthia has been saying, it's just, we ought to have a government that, just to begin with, sees the problems, just sees them. Let's start with that. Sees the people and sees the problems that they're living with, and then just does their fucking job, to solve those problems. That's all we're talking about. It's really not a high bar. It's the most basic thing that democracy is supposed to do, but that we in this state have had a political machine that has failed to do that for a long, long time. And what we are offering is an opportunity to finally have that, to finally have a not just a governor, not just a lieutenant governor, but a government that is going to see the people and look out for them and fight for them.
Senator Cynthia Mendes running for lieutenant governor, Matt Brown, former secretary of state and gubernatorial candidate, running for governor in the Democratic primaries. I'm sure we'll talk again sometime between now and next September.
Can't wait.
Thanks, Bill.
Rhode Island's podcast of record, B-Town.
At HealthSource RI for Employers, we provide access to health insurance to more than 1,100 local businesses and nonprofits, and 96% of them renew through us every year. Maybe it's our choice of 19 different health plans, our 10 years of customizing solutions, or our one local team of dedicated experts helping employers find quality health insurance. See how our numbers stack up for you. Learn more at healthsourceri.com/employers.